This episode of New Politics was released on the 29th of June, 2024, and produced on the lands of the Wangal and Gadigal people.
Welcome to New Politics. In this episode, Julian Assange is free at last. The nuclear announcement last week was never about energy, it was all about Peter Dutton's leadership. Senator Fatima Payman crosses the floor to vote for Palestinian statehood. And how much should the Governor-General be paid? I'm Eddie Djokovic, editor of New Politics.
I'm David Lewis, lapidrist.
And a few people have asked us, well, what's all this Patreon and Substack business all about? You mention it every episode, but what actually is it? Both of those are a subscriber platform, and you will receive an early release of the weekly New Politics podcast and 2 or 3 pieces of comprehensive analysis of the big political issues each week. And it's exactly the same material that we publish on both platforms. Some people prefer Patreon, some people prefer Substack, and there are some articles that we publish which are totally free for everyone. But the paid subscriptions, they're only $5 per month. You can subscribe at a higher rate too if you wish to. It's the cost of a regular coffee at a not-so-fancy cafe in Western Sydney, so it's not very much at all. And as we keep saying, David, this is a very good way to support independent media and independent journalism.
I think the last few years have shown how important it is to have independent journalists free of the big owners of the media who do their very best to control the narrative. Having alternative viewpoints, having less vested interest in your analysis is a better thing for democracy. And this week in particular, where we've seen the whole Julian Assange thing finally come to an end, I think it's important to remember that independent media is a vital tool of a functioning democracy.
Julian Assange has finally been released from Belmarsh Jail, where he was incarcerated for over 5 years. And this brings an end to a long-running saga that commenced in 2010 when WikiLeaks released footage of the United States military killing civilians in Baghdad. And these are considered war crimes, although no one has ever been charged over them. The Australian government of different persuasions did nothing about Julian Assange or his predicament. Some said a lot of things about releasing him when they were in opposition and then went on to do nothing when they were actually in government. Some had outright hostility. Here's former Prime Minister Julia Gillard on the ABC's Q&A program in 2011.
But I do have a view about the merits and morals of the Act, and I simply don't see the moral force in it. I have got a lot of respect for people who whistleblow. There are people who have worked for Big Tobacco who have got information into the public domain, been whistleblowers, they've acted for a moral purpose. I respect that. At the centre of WikiLeaks, I don't see that moral purpose. It's just,
You didn't see any potential moral purpose in the leaked documents which showed that Middle Eastern potentates were behaving corruptly?
Well, no, in this sense.
Because some people say that some of those issues helped lead, for example, in Tunisia, to the overthrow of the government.
But what I'm going to really is Assange's motivations. And I think if your motivation, I can respect whistleblowing if your motivation is to right wrong.
So what do you think his motivation is?
His motivation, as stated, is a sort of anarchic, here it all is, just have it. And I don't have a great deal of respect for that.
And there's been a lot of criticism of the Albanese government for acting too slowly on this, including from us. But as we suggested, there was a lot of work going on diplomatically behind the scenes, and it's finally come to fruition. Here's the legal counsel for Julian Assange, Jennifer Robinson, after the US court hearing in Saipan.
Today is a historic day. It brings to an end 14 years of legal battles. And finally, after 14 years of legal battles, Julian Assange can go home a free man. This also brings to an end a case which has been recognised as the greatest threat to the First Amendment in the 21st century. So it is a huge relief to Julian Assange, to his family, to his friends, to his supporters, and to us, and to everyone who believes in free speech around the world, that he can now return home to Australia and be reunited with his family. I want to take this opportunity to thank the many people who have, around the world, supported Julian Assange over these years and who have supported us in defending him. There has been a global movement behind Julian to protect free speech, and it is because of that global movement of support that today's outcome is possible. I also want to take time to thank the Australian people and the Australian government for all of the support that we've received from home in Australia. In particular, I want to thank our Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, for his statesmanship, his principled leadership and his diplomacy, which made this outcome possible. It was as Leader of the Opposition, he said, and took a stand for justice and said, enough is enough, there is nothing to be served by Julian's continued incarceration. As Prime Minister, he stood true to his word and he did what he needed to do to ensure Julian's freedom. He raised it at the highest level, at every opportunity, and when Australian officials were making outreach to the US, they knew that they were acting with the full authority of the Prime Minister of Australia. It was his intention that this be done, and we wouldn't be here today without the Prime Minister of Australia's support. So I want to thank Prime Minister Anthony Albanese.
So Julian Assange is now a free man, and there's always going to be division about some of the work that WikiLeaks performed, especially in the work that they did to campaign against Hillary Clinton in the 2016 US presidential election. But this is the nature of the work. It's not a question of whether we like the material that's being released or not. It's a question of the public's right to know what their governments get up to. And I think this has always been the essential part of this case.
Assange, and it was the website, and it was Chelsea Manning gave Julian Assange that film. WikiLeaks releases it. As someone who works in journalism, at least here, it's frightening that Assange could be arrested for doing the job of a journalist. Did Chelsea Manning do the wrong thing? That's a slightly different debate. I'm inclined to think not, that given the seriousness of what was happening, that stuff needed to be aired. There are other legal opinions that said that she'd gone against various undertakings and oaths that she'd taken and that in principle it was wrong. I'm not inclined to that view, but I can see why you might think that. It was a massive mistake on the part of the US government. And Assange has just lost 12 years of his life where he could have continued being a productive journalist. Now, I know that there are those of you out there who think, well, he's just another right-wing nut job, more closely aligned to somebody like Russell Brand or Joe Rogan. And sure, we're still allowed to disagree with him. The point is, though, it's not illegal to be that, if he is indeed that. It's not illegal to be unpleasant as an individual. It's not illegal to be rude. Now, I know sometimes we think it should be. But all of the things that they ended up accusing him of tended to be not criminal acts.
Well, riding a skateboard within the Ecuadorian embassy or owning a cat.
Yes, neither of those are illegal. Now, I don't ride a skateboard, but if I did, I'm sure I'd love to go through the halls of an embassy on one. I do own a cat, so I guess I'm in danger. It was essentially locking somebody up for holding truth to power, and we shouldn't tolerate that at all.
Oh, absolutely not. But the charges against Julian Assange should never have been made in the first place. And we can argue about the legal process and the precedents that need to be followed and all those sorts of issues. But this was primarily to send out the message to anyone out there, whether it's Julian Assange or us or anyone else, that if you release this sort of material, there are going to be consequences. And in the case of Chelsea Manning, it was 7 years in prison. In the case of Julian Assange, it was 5 years in prison, 7 years in the Ecuadorian embassy, and 14 years of harassment by the Swedish, the British and the United States governments. And the point here is that war crimes that were committed by the United States military in Iraq and Afghanistan were exposed. Over 65,000 civilians were killed in Iraq during these operations. And this is information that was released about terrible events that we would have never, ever found out about otherwise. And that is a service to the public and to the public interest, and we do have a right to know about these issues. But we ended up having this ridiculous situation where the people who alerted the public about these war crimes, that's Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning in this case, they go to jail. The perpetrators of those war crimes do not, and there's no consequences for them. Here's Julian Assange's US lawyer, Barry Pollack, talking about the case.
There was a very narrow, agreed-upon set of facts here, and Mr. Assange acknowledges that, of course, he accepted documents from Chelsea Manning and published many of those documents because it was in the world's interest that those documents be published. Unfortunately, that violates the terms of the Espionage Act. That's what we acknowledge today. We also said, and Mr. Assange said very clearly, that he believes there should be First Amendment protection for that conduct. But the fact of the matter is, as written, the Espionage Act does not have a defense for the First Amendment. So what he acknowledged is what he has to acknowledge, which is true and nothing that he should be ashamed of. Yes, he received classified information from Chelsea Manning, and he published that information. He has, I think, spurred an important discussion in the United States about how to balance national security and freedom of the press. He has standed by his principles, putting up with detention in the embassy, incarceration in a high-security prison. I hope that every one of us would have the courage to stand by our ideals the way Mr. Assange has, and so I certainly hope he feels that he has left a powerful legacy.
So we can see that there are problems with the US Espionage Act, and these are not unintended consequences either. It's exactly the way that the United States government wants it to work, but there are serious problems with this act. Now, it's not up to the Australian government to do anything about this. It's up to the US government, but it's something that definitely needs to change.
We have had in the past equivalents. The Espionage Act was passed in 1917. And it was passed as a direct result of communist agitation in the United States. And it was set as really an anti-communist because the Russian Revolution had happened. There was a panic in the West, the fear that it would spread right throughout the world. Now, Germany had a failed insurrection in 1917. I think there were riots in France, but, there's always riots in France. So the democracy capitalist side of things got very worried. So the United States passes the Espionage Act, which prima facie was about giving state secrets to overseas powers or providing state secrets to overseas powers, except it was really utilised against members of the Communist Party. Now in Australia in 1926, the Crimes Act was amended for essentially the same purpose, to stop basically communists being able to form. This ends up being a 30-year legal battle, 25-year, culminating in the 1951 referendum, in which Australians were asked, do they support a constitutional ban on the Communist Party? 51 to 49% said no, they do not support that. It went all the way to the High Court, and when it lost in the High Court, Menzies took it to referendum. But the Crimes Act in 1926 was basically an attempt to outlaw the Communist Party. The Espionage Act in 1917 in the States was an attempt to outlaw the Communist Party. The Espionage Act was never repealed or even much amended. The Crimes Act gets amended again in 1934 and then in 1948. And the Espionage Act really was used against not necessarily spies, but people the government didn't like. Rosenbergs were executed under the auspices of the Espionage Act, for example. And the debate still rages as to whether they were guilty or innocent, with most of the evidence pointing towards that they were innocent and hence wrongly executed. But because they were prominent communists, various factions in the US government thought they had to be taken out. It's sordid, and it's what Julian Assange has pled guilty to. It was a plea deal. The judge, in a quite strange but also quite honest, which is probably what makes it strange, judgment, said that in 2012 he might have thought that the decision was right, but now it's in 2024, we know the decision is wrong, and basically allowed time served and let Assange go.
And the case of Julian Assange has brought together some weird combinations from people on all sides of politics. In the United States, there was Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Marjorie Taylor Greene united in their quest to end the charges against Julian Assange. In Australia, we had the members of the Australian Greens, the Independents, Labor Party, Barnaby Joyce and George Christensen, although the Liberal Party did oppose a motion in May to bring Julian Assange home. They were all against it except for Bridget Archer, and once again the Liberal Party comes down on the wrong side of history. So it is a diplomatic success for the Labor government, and there's been 5 Prime Ministers since the case against Julian Assange commenced, and the only Prime Minister who's done anything about it has been Anthony Albanese. Here's the Prime Minister making an announcement about this situation.
Issue of Mr Assange. We have engaged and advocated Australia's interests using all appropriate channels to support a positive outcome. And you would now be aware of the consular assistance being provided to Mr Assange, including the presence right now of High Commissioner Smith as well as Ambassador Rudd there as part of providing that support. I've been very clear as Labor leader and as Prime Minister that regardless of your views about Mr Assange's activities, his case has dragged on for too long. There is nothing to be gained from his continued incarceration, and we want him brought home to Australia. That's something I said as Labor leader, it's something I've said as Prime Minister, and it's something that I will have more to say about once these legal proceedings have concluded.
So it is a good outcome for Julian Assange. Not the process to finally arrive at this outcome, but the outcome itself. And it's a good outcome for media freedom as well. And not that many in the mainstream media came out to support Julian Assange. There were all those ABC journalists who came out years ago to say that Julian Assange is not a journalist, and were happy that he was booted out of the Ecuadorian embassy and the prospect of facing trial in the United States. And these same journalists now do that rubbish, also known as news breakfast on the ABC, which is not only an insult to journalism, but also an insult to people's intelligence.
And breakfast.
And their breakfast as well. But that's an issue that we can look at another day, David. But there are still those cases of other whistleblowers who are still suffering. David McBride is in jail, sentenced by an Australian court. The Attorney-General, Mark Dreyfus, could have put a stop to that case, but he didn't. The case against Richard Boyle continues, and he had his right to appeal under the protection of the Public Interest Disclosure Act, dismissed last week. And Mark Dreyfus could also put an end to that case tomorrow if he wanted to. Both of these cases are totally outrageous, and the end to the case against Julian Assange should put pressure on the Attorney-General to release David McBride from jail and put an end to the trial against Richard Boyle. These are people who called out criminal activities and should be lauded as heroes in the public interest, not facing jail time.
Yeah, it's odd that the people pointing out the wrongdoing are the ones who get in trouble. Now, if they were pointing out stuff and it was malicious and not true, that's fine. You would expect some kind of consequence for that. But we know that what they said was true. They backed it up with evidence. They had the receipts, as the kids say. And it should be that a government that wants transparency should be encouraging. They should set up a whistleblowers support where you can go. Now, I know that some of this stuff will be abused by people looking to settle grudges, and a lot of time will be wasted with frivolous and false attacks. But you can put things in like, well, if you're shown to have put in a false attack or a malicious attack, you get fined and you have to pay for the investigation to try and discourage that type of stuff. It's important that we allow wrongdoing, no matter who did it, no matter why they did it. But it's important that we allow wrongdoing to be exposed and that proper and adequate consequence be meted out to the perpetrators, not the careers of whistleblowers destroyed because people have tried to do the right thing. And I've said this before, from the day you start school, and probably before for some of you, you're told if you see something wrong, tell someone in authority because that's the right thing to do. It doesn't seem to be the right thing to do. Now Assange is gone, maybe it can be the big 3 or 4. and let them all go. Yet we needed to get Julian out. That was a lot of detail and a lot of effort, and now we can look at the other three. And I hope that's the case. I'm not sure it is, but I hope it is.
This is New Politics with Eddie Djokovic and David Lewis, one of Australia's top 10 podcasts on Australian politics and news commentary. You can also find us at newpolitics.com.au, and you can also support us through Patreon and Substack.
That's not supposed to happen. Ready on 6, on 5, on 4, on 3, on 2, activate. Now, shut down. Shut down immediately.
The nuclear debate has run out of steam for the time being, but maybe the original intention of this debate has been achieved. It was never a serious proposition because it never had to be. It was all about positioning the leader of the opposition, Peter Dutton, as a leader with a plan, waste the time of the government and everyone else trying to put out the real facts and give the mainstream media something to amuse themselves with. But there is some other speculation going on here that even though Peter Dutton has got the Liberal Party to a competitive level in the opinion polls, and in one poll he was actually preferred Prime Minister, although I do think that these poll numbers are actually quite soft, the nuclear announcement was made to stave off a potential leadership challenge from Angus Taylor, and he's the shadow treasurer for the Liberal Party. Several weeks ago there was talk of a dirt file dossier provided to News Corporation journalists, 270 pages of dirt and rubbish about Peter Dutton and his family. And we saw some of that during the week with the release of photographs of Peter Dutton's son holding a bag of white powder published on the front page of News Corporation publications. Now, it wasn't clear what the white powder was, but just saying that it's white powder is usually enough for most people to fill in the gaps. And within that nuclear debate last week, there was some unusually tough questioning and commentary from Sky News about Dutton's nuclear energy announcement, which we don't normally get from the conservative news outlets. And as we suggested last week, the nuclear announcement wasn't anything to do with nuclear energy. It was about debasing renewables, giving the Liberal Party something to talk about, but it was also about leadership issues within the Liberal Party.
Yeah, Dutton hasn't been the most inspiring of Liberal leaders. I think that's fair to say. He's nowhere near a Howard in terms of his ability to communicate. He's nowhere near a Menzies. He's nowhere near a Turnbull or an Abbott, to be quite honest, who at least were interesting characters. Turnbull had a competency about him, or has a competency about him. Abbott had an energy about him, which wasn't good, but at least lifted him above the crowd a little bit. That he had nothing else probably pointed to the fact that his prime ministership didn't last as long as he would have liked it to. But at least there was an energy there and a charisma that appealed to some people. Didn't appeal to everybody, but it did appeal to some people. Dutton is not a charismatic man. He doesn't seem to be very as intelligent as other political leaders around. He's not a good communicator, which may cancel out my other one. He may be as smart as everyone else. He just doesn't communicate it as well. And he's not terribly, John Howard was loved by his supporters. Tony Abbott got some love. Malcolm Turnbull was loved by his supporters. That these supporters weren't the majority of the party at certain times is irrelevant. There was that deep, deep connection that they all managed to get. Also, in my saying that, this is just observation. It's not an endorsement of any of them.
I think we accept that.
Yeah, so a new listener might think, oh, I thought this was a progressive. Here he is praising. And I'm not really praising. I'm just pointing out that you could find people who would tell you of their unbounded love for those ones. You note that I'm not mentioning Scott Morrison. that's a whole other story. Dutton doesn't seem to have that. He gets a grudging regard, I think, from people who want to believe he's a strong leader and decisive and all of that.
And I think in any political party or for any political leader, they not only have to worry about the other side of politics or other political parties, but they also have to worry about MPs from their own side. And that doesn't matter who you are or how well you're doing. There's always going to be someone that's after your job as the leader, as Bob Hawke found out all those years ago. And
Yes.
The New South Wales and the Victoria branches of the Liberal Party, they absolutely despise each other. And that's been a historical issue for these branches. And there's also a big distaste of the Queensland branch as well. And that's partially because it's diluted through the Liberal National Party merger, and as well as the Liberal component in Queensland being too reactionary for the New South Wales branch. And that's actually saying something, because it's not like the New South Wales branch of the Liberal Party is a beacon of moderation or anything like that. So leadership issues and internal Liberal Party machinations have got a lot to do with this nuclear energy announcement last week, but it was also to take up the time, the space and the energy of the government and everyone else. And it really is hard work to make the facts catch up with the fiction. And it also created division, confusion, and that's what conservative politics is really good at, bringing everyone down to their soiled and putrid level of public debate, all that mud wrestling process and those sort of issues. And it also allowed the media to promote and put out some more division, and they seem to be more concerned about the Labor government pushing or publishing some nuclear memes about Dutton's announcement rather than Peter Dutton's announcement itself. Here's a ridiculous question from a journalist at the Australian newspaper.
Are you at all concerned that the three-eyed fish memes and so forth are undermining the consensus on AUKUS?
I note some in the media, and the coalition have attempted to be very worried about some cartoons and some memes going out. I'm happy to engage in a debate about facts when it comes to nuclear energy, because the facts and the science tells us that it simply doesn't stack up. And I have been somewhat bemused by some of the coverage, because I know that if I stood here as Labor Prime Minister and said, I've got this policy that's going to cost hundreds of billions of dollars, that's going to completely reverse the direction in which Australia is going, but I can't tell you how much it'll cost. I can't tell you what any of the economics associated with it are. I can't tell you what the time frame will be. I can't tell you who will pay for it. I reckon the coverage might be a bit different than some of the coverage which is there.
So it was a ridiculous question, but it was indicative of the many types of questions that were asked by the media on this nuclear announcement.
You've pointed out many times that we've had reports going back to the 1980s showing that nuclear power isn't economically feasible in Australia. The idea they were pushing, we haven't had the full discussion yet. The 1980s is now 40 years ago. A discussion isn't a thing where you keep talking till everybody accepts your point, whether right or wrong. We've had the discussion. We've found we didn't need it. They know we don't need it. They had 13 years to put it up. They had 15 years or whatever it was under Howard to put it up. It never did. I thought Stephen Miles in Queensland was being rather mischievous when he said that he thought Dutton was right about the federal government being able to bring in nuclear power into the state of Queensland. And I think that was really a fairly clever vote gaining strategy.
And we've got a little snippet of Stephen Miles saying that as well, so here it is.
The one thing that is crystal clear to me is that if David Crisafulli was the Premier, then Queensland would get nuclear reactors. That would include nuclear reactors near here. And those nuclear reactors would need to store dangerous nuclear waste, not for 50 years, not for 100 years, for tens of thousands of years. That's the scale of this kind of decision. And for David Crisafulli to just wipe his hands, say he doesn't have to take a view, that it's not his plan, it's Canberra's plan, well, that's not good enough. The leader of our state should take a position on what should happen in our state. Now, I've said, unlike other states, we own these sites and we own the transmission system. And that gives us an ability to say no to Peter Dutton. And I have said I would say no to Peter Dutton. What we know is David Crisafulli is not strong enough to say no to him.
I think Stephen Miles stating that was quite clever. It might backfire on him. People might think, well, if they're going to let it anyway, we may as well have the other side in. Where it did work was that it showed that Dutton could get media traction. And that's a big part for any leader. You can be the most popular speaker in front of a crowd, but if the media don't push through with it, you're nowhere, really. And, of course, I saw Gina Reinhardt on the cover of probably the Telegraph saying that, it's time we went nuclear. And, of course, she'd say that because she knows it gives coal another 20 years while we get everything ready. So it was a disaster of a policy. It was never meant to be a good policy, but it might have stretched Dutton out another couple of months.
And in politics, with every action, there has to be a counter action. And the Prime Minister has announced a new chair of the Climate Change Agency, and it's none other than former New South Wales Liberal Treasurer and MP, Matt Kean, and he was very active on climate change issues within the New South Wales government, and he announced his resignation from the New South Wales Parliament, and then a few days later he was by the side of Anthony Albanese in Canberra making these announcements.
In 2019, when I was appointed as the Energy Minister by Gladys Berejiklian, I was told the first day on the job that in the next decade, 4 of the state's coal-fired power stations would come to an end. And we needed a mechanism in place to replace that capacity. Now, we looked at all options, including nuclear. Now, I didn't want to bankrupt the state, and I didn't want to put those huge costs onto families. That's why we introduced the Electricity Infrastructure Roadmap, which planned the transition to renewables backed up by firming and storage. This is not about ideology. This is about outcomes. And the experts tell us, and I agree with them, that if we get this transition right, we can not only put downward pressure on electricity bills for families and businesses right across the country, but we can protect our environment and make our economy even stronger and more prosperous for everyone forever. The cheapest way to transition our electricity system is to move towards renewables backed up by firming and also storage.
Generally, it's not a good move for governments to appoint people from the other side of politics. Now, theoretically, it's good for public interest to have people from different parties involved in government appointments, but practically, I think it creates all sorts of problems. Kevin Rudd appointing Peter Costello as the chair of the Future Fund was a real political problem for Kevin Rudd and put him offside with a lot of his colleagues at the time. The appointment of Brendan Nelson to the War Memorial, I think it also caused issues for Kevin Rudd, but to a lesser extent. But aside from this, I think that appointing Matt Kean was actually a very clever move politically, and it will upset some Labor backbenchers, but it seems to have upset more people in the coalition, people like Barnaby Joyce and Matt Canavan. But I think it shows that the government wants to have bipartisanship and consensus on climate change issues. They're obviously not going to get it from the Liberal or the National parties, so this is the next best thing. And it showed up the coalition for the fools that they really are on climate change issues. And Matt Kean, even though he's from the Liberal Party and he was a former New South Wales parliamentarian, well, he's just got to be now like any other bureaucrat. He just has to follow the government's agenda. But I do think that it's a good strategic move for the Labor government to make.
I think if he's the best person for the job, then that's who they go for. Matt Kean did, of course, support Gladys Berejiklian and say that ICAC had overstepped its mark and all of that. He's not the great white hope of Australian moderate liberalism that we might think he is, but he was one of the more tolerable members of that appalling government. And it seems that having tried to change the party's mind and failing, he's moved on to other ways of trying to fix the environment. And if this is the case, then he should be supported in that. And hopefully he'll actually, I won't say hopefully, I'm sure he'll be a positive asset to the department. And all we can do from now is wait and hope that it's not going to be a disaster.
This is New Politics, available through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Audible and YouTube, and also available to support at Patreon, Substack, and at our website, newpolitics.com.au.
There was a vote in the Senate during the week to recognise the state of Palestine, and this should actually be quite an unspectacular process. There's already 146 of the 193 United Nations member states already recognising the state of Palestine, and that's over 75% of countries all across the world. And Australia should just muster up that little bit of courage to support Palestine on a diplomatic level. The motion in the Senate was proposed by the Australian Greens and supported by the independent senators, David Pocock and Lydia Thorpe. But it was one other senator who received all of the attention, and that was the Labor Senator, Fatima Payman, and she also voted in support of the motion. Here's Senator Payman speaking about this motion afterwards.
We cannot believe in two-state solutions and only recognise one. I'm reminded that the great Bob Hawke once said in his op-ed in 2017 that it is the least we can do now in these most challenging of times is to do what 137 other nations have already done, and that's grant diplomatic recognition to the state of Palestine. I ponder how the party icons like him, like Gough Whitlam, like Paul Keating, can justify its current position. Should we not be true to their legacy? I was not elected as a token representative of diversity. I was elected to serve the people of Western Australia and uphold the values instilled in me by my late father. Today I have made a decision that would make him proud and make everyone proud who are on the side of humanity.
The Labor Party rules do allow for a senator or an MP to be expelled or suspended by the party, and there is a belief that this is implemented automatically if you vote against the vote of the caucus, but that's not the case. The Prime Minister has already indicated that there won't be any action against Senator Payman. In the end, the motion was defeated by 52 votes to 13, and it just goes to show how tied to the United States the Australian government is and how tied it is to the Israel lobby in Australia. And I think it also goes to show how far we have to go to have any independent thought on international relationships in the Middle East that's separate to the thinking and the actions of the United States.
I guess we should talk about caucus solidarity in that it was brought in for a really good reason when the Federal Labor Party was formed. The 6 state Labor parties were totally different. Queensland was very radical. New South Wales and Victoria had the Catholic influence. Tasmania was very conservative. And none of them agreed 100% in line. So caucus was set up that they could all meet, hash out the debate, vote on the debate. Once the debate was settled, that was it. You voted for the party. Otherwise, you could be expelled. Whether this is still a good way of doing things or not, whether times have moved on in the 130 years since the Labor Party was formed, etc., is another subject open for debate. But certainly, Senator Payman risked a lot in standing up. And considering, too, that there are other members of the party who gritted their teeth, I'm assuming, and voted against their better instincts. It makes her stance just that little bit more brave. I can't see that she'll be expelled. The optics of it would be terrible. She may not get that Parliament committee that she was eyeing off, for example, and I don't know that she'll get into cabinet in the next round of selections. But it's good, I think, that the party does have at least some dissenting voices that are public dissenting voices. I think that having all the arguments off stage makes a lot of sense in many ways, but it also makes less sense in an era where we're trying for more transparency. And you want to know who your local members are and who your senators are. Now, I know that she will lose some votes. There'll be some people who say, oh, look at her, she should be supporting the Labor Party, or she should be supporting the government and the State of Israel. That's fine, but that's part of standing up. There's a famous quote by Churchill when he asks someone, do you have any enemies? And they say, yes. He says, good, that means you've stood up for something. I hope that she keeps her pre-selection, provided, of course, that she continues doing the job she presumably has been doing as senator. And that's always a risk that, we've pushed her down to number 4 because suddenly 3 more qualified candidates popped up. How did that happen? I hope she continues her career in politics. I hope she doesn't feel the need to leave the Labor Party, because I think those voices are important within the Labor Party, and it may just influence others who are on the fence, perhaps.
And I guess that's the way that she's hoping that it will work.
Yeah.
But the motion itself, it was proposed by the Australian Greens more as a political manoeuvre than anything else. Even if the motion had been passed, it wouldn't have forced the government to do anything at all. But it was a strong symbolic measure of support for the people of Palestine. It's sending out the message to the Palestinian community in Australia that we're listening to you, we hear what you're saying, and this is the least that we can do, recognise the state of Palestine. So although the Labor Party can expel Senator Payman if they wanted to, they can't really politically because they have so much backlash from their rank and file membership. She's supporting true Labor internationalist values and booting out a woman, a Muslim, Afghan-born, a young person. And it is a very valuable and hard-won Senate seat in Western Australia that the Labor Party will have for the next 4 years. And I just think that expelling her would be the worst decision that the Labor Party could make. And having her there at least gives the Labor Party some credibility on issues relating to Gaza and on Palestine.
As someone pointed out, can you be expelled for following party policy? It would create a very interesting precedent, wouldn't it? And if you're going to make a splash, make a big one. And I don't mean to trivialise what she's done. I think what she's done, as I said, is very brave and the right thing to do. And yeah, hopefully a couple of other members of Parliament will look at that and say, she's right, and start to change their public view rather than their private ones.
And there has been less reporting on the events in Gaza, but the genocide in Gaza is still continuing. There's rocket attacks by the Israel Defence Force every day against civilians. Classrooms are still being bombed. Aid workers are still being attacked. And there's still the continuing attacks in the West Bank. And now the Netanyahu government wants to expand this war to engage with Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. And I think this is what happens when the West supports a nutcase, lunatic Zionist leader in Israel. And it's got the potential to completely destabilise the Middle East. I don't think it will, but the potential is still there. So these acts of war are still continuing in Palestine. And although it's not as prevalent within the Australia's media as it was a couple of weeks ago, the anti-war and anti-genocide actions are continuing all around Australia on a weekly basis in the major capital cities. And I think there is still enough support to continue with this pressure so it doesn't become forgotten like Ukraine seems to have become forgotten, or like Darfur was, or how Bosnia and Rwanda were forgotten about all those years ago. I think the action and pressure will still continue until there is a resolution in Gaza.
The situation is becoming more and more untenable. We've seen the attitude of the Australian government start to pivot. Again, it's a black spot on the Australian government's record. We've seen even a hardcore, committed, pro-Israel president like Joe Biden start to soften his stance and become critical. So there's, I think, an understanding out there that things have gone way too far and that it's not a war. It's not defence. It's a genocide. Netanyahu has managed to put his trial off till March next year because of this. And that's part of it. The other part, of course, is the gas in the Gulf, just off the coast of Gaza, which they can't get to if it's under another country's international borders. But things are changing, and hopefully they're changing to the point where Australia will start to treat the Palestinian people like human beings. I hear stories of Palestinians not being able to get refugee visas, but they give visitor visas that then get revoked at the end of the 3 months. that there's a $5,000 US fee per person to get a visitor's visa to Australia if you're in Palestine. This is disgraceful. We've got to grow up. And this is why, again, it's good that at least one member of the Labor Party, the Greens have been consistent on this. Some of the independents have been consistent on this. Others have been consistent the other way. But those who are on the right side of history, and hint, the right side of history is never on the side that's committing the genocide. I think that she may even represent parts of the Labor Party deciding to stand up for what they've always believed in and what they know is right. And again, I say this every week, Netanyahu government doesn't mean to say that the Israeli people or the state of Israel needs to be taken down. I know a lot of people think that. Doesn't necessarily mean that. It does mean that the rotten eggs in the basket have to be removed as quickly and as legally and as effectively as possible.
The new Governor-General, Samantha Mostyn, is commencing her 5-year term next week, but the first bit of news about her in the lead-up to the appointment is a $214,000 increase in the salary, and that's up from the $495,000 that was provided to the previous Governor-General, David Hurley. Now, there's several issues to consider here. No one really complained about the increase that David Hurley received when he was the Governor-General, and that was an increase of $70,000 back in 2019. But now that it's a woman who's getting this salary and a woman appointed by the Labor government, there's howls of outrage about it in the media. But I think that's not really the point. You get all of the trappings of office, food, accommodation, servants, and the salary is fixed to the salary of the Chief Justice of the High Court. Now, I'm not sure why that is, but that is the case. And that situation was legislated back in 2019. We had the increase of salaries for federal politicians of 3.5% a few weeks ago, and now there's a salary increase of 42% for the Governor-General. Now, there's also been suggestions that the increase is because Samantha Mostyn hasn't got the military or judiciary pension that most of her predecessors have had, and this increase will make up for that, but that's not really the problem of the public to address. And paying an extra $214,000 a year for the Governor-General isn't going to break the bank, but it just seems like a very insensitive thing to do when we keep hearing about the cost of living pressures that everyone else is under.
The Governor-General does get a pension, I thought. Now, it might not be the same size as the military pensions that the others get and public service pensions that the others get. The other thing, too, is that the Governor-General lives rent-free, has most meals supplied to her, most transport supplied to her. Now, it's a big job. When I say it's a big job, it's a 7-day-a-week job. There's not a lot of downtime. You're flying all over the country. The last time I met a Governor-General, it was in Sydney, and they were flying to Darwin half an hour after leaving the event I was at to do something up there, and then flying to Perth that evening for something the next morning. So it's not a job where there's a lot of downtime. You can rest on the plane or what have you, but it's not like being at home surfing YouTube or what have you. And the Governor-General as head of state, and I think I'm more inclined to call it head of state, should look respectable, should have decent clothes, decent hairstyles, look neat and tidy, which a good salary will help with. The head of state has to present to the world and to the country. And if you look like you're underpaid, that could have an effect. And of course, you don't want the head of state to run into financial issues because they're not being paid enough. And so a good salary is not offensive. But $700,000, now that's more than the Prime Minister, admittedly, but the Prime Minister is likely overpaid. I think that they really need, and this will never happen, a proper independent panel made up of HR experts, made up of people from ACOS and other welfare groups, made up of financial advisors to work out what's the optimum amount. My suspicion is that it will come in somewhere under $719,000 a year, but it would still be a fairly big cost. I guess the other thing too is that some of this money might be royalties from Linda Hurley's songs that have flowed into the office.
Oh, well, that could be the case, but the point is that whether you're earning $300,000 or $500,000 or $700,000 as the Governor-General, you're still going to take up that position. So that's one point. The other criticisms that we've received is, well, you should shut up about this. There's nothing to worry about here. What's the big deal? But the other point is that, say if it was Scott Morrison that appointed someone like Janet Albrechtsen, for example, as the Governor-General, and then provided a $200,000 increase within the first week of them commencing the term, well, we wouldn't be very happy about that either.
No, for sure. And we have pointed out that Sam Mostyn is an appropriate choice in the way that one of Morrison's appointees wouldn't have been. And there's a sense in which I don't begrudge her the money. She didn't we assume, and pretty safely assume, that she didn't walk in and demand, this is what I want to take the job. It's just, again, one of those badly timed announcements at the wrong time, going from a very comfortable salary to an even more comfortable salary. I don't think she's going to be a dud as Governor-General, but you never know. But then again, these things are often two drops in the teapot, hardly noticeable, and it'll go over, and we'll go on to have a very good Governor-General who's been paid more than the ones before,
That's it for this episode of New Politics. Thanks for listening in. And if you'd like to support our style of journalism and commentary, please make a donation at our website at newpolitics.com.au. We don't beg, plead, beseech or gaslight you about journalism coming to an end. We just keep it very simple. If you like what we do, please send some support our way. It keeps our commitment to independent journalism ticking along. I'm Eddie Djokovic. Thanks for listening in, and it's goodbye to our listeners.
I'm David Lewis. We'll see you next time.